Hey. Is it? Everyone can hear me all right? All right, awesome. Hey everyone, yeah, thank you very much for coming, giving up your night to listen to me and others speak. My name's Jack, that's where you can find me on Twitter, and yeah, I'm going to be talking about moving from Angular to React, which is something I spent nearly the last year of my life doing, and I've lived to tell the tale. I work for a company called Thread, as was mentioned, but this actual talk is all about the work I did at a previous company called Songkick. So just for a bit of background, this isn't from my current job, this is from Songkick. Really, when I started putting the talk together, I thought that it would end up being very specifically about Angular and React, but it's turned into one of these talks that I think is a bit more generic, and hopefully even if Angular to React doesn't quite map to what you're up to, if you're doing something else to React, I'm presuming no one here is migrating away from React, given the meetup title, but hopefully there'll be some interesting stuff, even if you're not doing exactly what I've been doing. So yeah, I did this over the last year at Songkick. Songkick, we sold tickets for people who wanted to go and listen to their favorite artists play. And the product that I specifically worked on was called The Store. And this is what it looked like, unstyled. So it listed all the dates that a particular artist was playing at a venue, and you could click and buy the tickets and buy VIP tickets and so on and so forth. Just for a bit of context in how this worked, this would be taken and embedded into an artist's website. So say you want to buy tickets to Adele, you go to adele.com and you see that it looks like this. And this kind of bit in the middle is that same store, just placed in an iframe. I've got a whole other talk on iframes, which I will leave for now. And this gets put in an iframe that the users then use, and they don't really know that it's like being built by Songkick. It looks to them just like it's part of Adele's website. I had tickets to that gig, and she cancelled it, and I'm definitely totally over it, but it's cool. So anyway, we sell tickets to those, and then they arrive in the post, and fans get happy, and then usually artists don't cancel on us, and we're good. So yeah, so just for kind of background, when I talk about the store, that is what I mean. It's particularly confusing in a React meetup because we have Redux stores and GraphQL stores and Apollo stores and lots of stores, but the store here just means the Songkick app that sold tickets to gigs, and this is what I worked on. And the store actually worked pretty well when I joined. It had been built in Angular. It was on Angular 1 point something, but changing it was very, very tricky. There was a few reasons for this that I won't go into, but the developers who had built it had since moved on. The code's kind of in a bit of an interesting state. Lots of features have been layered on top of others. There was lots of dead features, lots of stuff we need to be able to move very quickly on that we couldn't do. Effectively, what it came down to is we lacked confidence in the system. We couldn't move quickly. None of us really knew the code that well. There weren't too many Angular kind of enthusiasts in the team. I certainly wasn't one of them. And so we ended up thinking about moving away from Angular. And really, this talk breaks down into what I've called the 4 T's: the tech, test, team, and talking. So that's kind of the four kind of areas that we're going to focus on tonight. So I'll start with the tech. It hopefully doesn't come as a big surprise what language or framework rather we picked to move to. It's this one. And we decided on React for a number of reasons. I do have a set of slides that talks more about the reasons for picking React. I've avoided them because I think we're hopefully all at least partially on board with the idea of React being quite a good thing. If not, then you're probably the meetups downstairs that you were hoping for. And we had 2 ways that we could go about building this app. We could either do it in a big bang rewrite, or we could do it incrementally. And these are kind of 2 very different approaches, and what it came down to for us was when we could add value. If you think about rewriting it from the ground up, so we leave our existing Angular app going, and we start building a brand new React app, and they're entirely different code bases. The issue there is we still have bugs to fix and little tweaks to make on the existing old app whilst we're still building the new app. So you end up dividing your team in half. And over time, you start building the new app, and it gets bigger and bigger until it's closer to matching your legacy app. And then suddenly you get there, and then you've added some value. But you've only added value right at the far right-hand side of that graph. Instead, we went for the incremental approach. We could kind of rebuild, take small Angular parts, move them into React as one big existing app. And when you do that, you add value straight away. We were able to ship React code the 2 or 3 days after we started the project, which was really, really quick. And over time, we just added more and more. And the idea is you kind of grow from the inside out, a bit like Alien when it bursts through the chest, a bit like that. And that's how we ended up. This also enabled us to release early and release often, which was really important because I'll be honest with you, when we started, I wasn't entirely sure how it was going to work, taking an Angular app and just dumping bits of React into the page. In my head, it kind of made sense, but also wouldn't have been entirely surprised if something about Angular and React interacting with each other hadn't played nicely, and it could have all crashed and burned. But by doing this, we were able to kind of verify in the first week of this migration that we could do it the way we thought we could do it. And we could also make mistakes in how we were migrating certain bits of functionality and learn from them and release changes again. There's actually terminology for this. Martin Fowler wrote this post. I don't know if he came up with the initial term, but it's called the strangler application. You're strangling Angular from the strangular, I suppose, from the inside out. It's quite an interesting blog post about it, which you can read about. I'll put the slides up, or tweet them, or put them on Meetup, or whatnot. And yeah, we shipped migrated code very quickly after doing this. And the theory, how we managed and were able to go about doing this is because the old Angular app had been built in a very component-heavy way. Also, for those who aren't too familiar with Angular, at least Angular 1, I don't know about Angular 29 now, but Angular 1 called what React would call components directives. So for the most part, if I talk about an Angular directive, that maps pretty closely to a React component, at least closely enough for the purposes of this talk. So the theory was that now we're building apps as a bunch of components. You can really break them down into trees. And all an app is a big tree of components. And the ones at the top render other ones, which render other ones, and so on and so on and so on. And eventually you get to the point where the very bottom, the leaves of the tree, are just like single components that render some HTML. So we can imagine this is our whole app. So obviously greatly simplified diagram, but it kind of does the job. So the idea here is we could pick a really, really small thing, and we could move that over to React. This was a really good testing ground. It let us do things very quickly. We could then take other small things and move them to React. And at this point, we'd have an Angular controller or directive component, Angular something, rendering these three little bits of React. And that's all it would be doing. So at that point, we could replace their parent with a React component. And we could effectively rinse and repeat this up and up the tree all the way, kind of starting right at the bottom and working our way up until we had a whole tree of React components. And that was it, and that was the plan. And we did it on a whiteboard, and we spent kind of a lot of time breaking down this huge app into it, and it actually worked pretty well. So the way, I think, it says 35% over there somewhere, but we got it up, trust me. And I wrote do not rub off on it just to ensure that someone did rub it off at some point. So you can then start looking at your apps and just breaking them down into sets of components. So at the top here we have the fan club banner. So users could sign into their fan club to get like 10% off tickets or extra special VIP access or whatever it might be. And then we have listing rows that list all the particular gigs. And again, obviously, this breaks down into the listings title and the listings date and the listings button. So you just keep breaking this app down into really small components until you get to the smallest one that you possibly can, and then you can migrate that. And this here was actually the first part of the app that made it into React, just the date. We caused a bug by doing that, which is a whole other story I'll come on to in a bit. So it started off pretty smoothly. So migrating a component, again, for those who aren't too familiar with Angular 1, Angular 1 came at a time before we had the module system that we have now in JavaScript. ES 2015 modules weren't around. So Angular came up with their own one, which actually worked pretty well. I built a semi-large Angular app a few years ago, and doing it this way with Angular 1's dependency system was actually a really nice experience. The idea is that you register everything with Angular, and then you can just kind of inject it in, and Angular does magic behind the scenes to hook them up. So the first thing you have to do when you're migrating a bit of Angular is find all the other dependencies that it has. And you've got to migrate each of those one by one to React, or just plain JavaScript. You've actually got to remove any kind of history of Angular in that particular file. And then you can write the React component. These didn't look anything, these weren't different because we were writing them within Angular, and that was one of the really nice things about this approach. These components were completely standalone, normal React components. We tested them just like you test any other component, and there was nothing there was no mention of Angular in these, which was quite a big goal for us, that we wanted these components. If we'd have had to go and rewrite these components when we removed Angular, that would have basically made us migrate all over again. So these were just entirely regular, normal React components. And then we need to embed them within Angular. So again, Angular, rather than have like components in JSX like React, you use HTML templates. And in Angular, you'd have like this listings dash button would be an Angular directive or component. And that's how we'd render Angular components in Angular land. And we wanted to swap this out for a bit of React. And so if anyone else is planning on doing this, I can highly recommend a library called ng-react, which lets you render React apps within Angular. I think it's quite a niche use case, but it worked really, really well for what we needed it. So with ng-react, it gives you this Angular thing called react-component, and you tell it about all these React components that it can know about, and you can pick out listing button and pass the props down. It keeps them all in sync, it updates React, and it works really, really nicely. It was amazing how easy it was to just drop this in. And really, that library enabled the whole migration, the fact that that is able to work. So if you think back to how this maps to our tree, we've replaced this listings button, which is one of the small bits right at the bottom. So then we kept going on the tree, and we could replace the title. So rather than just have, in this case, this heading 2, we moved it to a React component called listings title. And at this point, we're at this stage. We've got just a list item that's rendering a bunch of React components. So we're now kind of roughly at this point. And at this point, we can migrate that whole part of the tree into one bigger React component. So now we have a listings item component that imports both the title and the button. It renders the list item, and it renders them with all the props and whatever else there might be on there. And now our Angular template just becomes a thing that effectively delegates to React. And that gets you to that point. So then you rinse and repeat that, and you do that over and over and over again, and eventually you start to get close to being vaguely finished with the migration. And that's really kind of technically how it went. And surprisingly, it did go pretty smoothly for the most part. And although this is obviously a simplification for the benefit of the talk, generally that was pretty close to how it actually went. So as we were doing this, we're obviously changing a lot of code constantly, and we're deploying often multiple times a day, certainly at least once a day. And we couldn't break the store. We had a lot of events going on sale constantly. There were users on the store pretty much around the clock. And we also had, at 9 a.m. one day, Adele tickets went on sale, and we had 100,000 people on the site at 9 a.m. So we had to be very careful that we couldn't, break things at certain points in particular. So the Angular app had a lot of unit tests, which was really good. So what you could do is you could port the Angular component, and then you could port the tests over as well. This isn't perfect because you do have to rewrite the tests, obviously, to map them from Angular land into React land. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the unit tests. If anyone particularly cares, we used Airbnb's Enzyme library and the Jest test runner from Facebook. And I wrote a blog post on it on SitePoint a while ago, and the link's down there as well if anyone's particularly interested. Or you can feel free to come and chat to me afterwards, and I can tell you more detail. There is a slight issue in this context with the unit tests, though, and that they're very tightly coupled to the implementation. So you migrate an Angular directive to a React component, and you move the tests over, and you think everything's working, but because you've changed the test code and you've had to interact with it, you don't know. You can't know for absolute sure. So really, we needed another suite of tests that were entirely decoupled to the actual code, tests that wouldn't care if we were in Angular or React land or even a bit of both. And for this, we reached for the necessary evil in the world, some acceptance tests. So acceptance tests actually fired up a browser, and they clicked through, and they bought tickets as if they were a user, and they picked which delivery they'd want, and we checked that all the order went through and all this stuff. They're entirely automated. They ran every time we pushed. They failed 50% of the time for legitimate reasons, and 50% of the time because they're acceptance tests. But on the whole, this was really good. And really, this was good because they were entirely decoupled to the application. This continued to work. At one point, this whole left-hand side was in React, but this bit was in Angular on the right. At different points, different parts of this page were React versus Angular. But the acceptance test could confirm that we hadn't broken anything and everything was interacting as it should. So they are really valuable. They are also really slow. So we picked out 4 or 5 core journeys of buying certain types of tickets that we ensured worked at all times, and we ran with that. So if you are ever migrating, you need to find some form of tests that work a level above the actual code and unit level. And when I first started working on this talk, I thought the whole talk would be about this kind of thing. But for me, it was the first time working on a bit of a larger running project. We had kind of a team of 2 or 3 developers for a whole year. And I found lots of interesting stuff about working in this kind of format over a long time, particularly when you're not actually adding features a lot of the time. It can be a little bit demoralizing to go to work and be like, what do you do today? Well, nothing visible. So kind of keeping the team going was really interesting. And we knew it was going to take at least 6 months, much more a year. Spoiler alert, it was effectively a year, and it wasn't quite finished. And this is all about keeping up the momentum, but also choosing what to work on. You've got this project that you know is going to be a year long. you've got all these features that need to be migrated. How do you actually pick out what to migrate and what order to do things in? Which part of the code are more important to migrate than others? And for us, that was a really interesting question, because if you think back to that graph where I had the really badly drawn boxes of different colors for adding value, we wanted to add value as soon as we could, and part of that was picking which bits to work on. And we used the fact that one of the goals of this migration was to make it easier to work and fix bugs with confidence. So we looked for parts of the code base and parts of the user experience that we knew were quite buggy and fixed them. So actually, when you think about migrating from Angular to React, you might think we pick the worst code. We pick the most confusing components and we'd migrate them first. But actually, we didn't do that. Code quality was kind of fairly low down our list of how we choose stuff to migrate. We picked it based on primarily bugs and how buggy it is. Particular sections of the app were very complicated and we struggled to understand them, but users worked with them, they worked, there were no bug reports, no customer support emails after a sale, they were fine. Other parts were really nicely written from a code point of view, but had a few key bugs that always tripped users up. Another factor we used was churn. And here the churn means how often developers are interacting with specific files in the code base. There's a particular component that a developer has to hit every time they make a change, and that file is hard to understand and work with. You probably want to migrate that first, because it's going to speed up everyone else on the team. So you can kind of split parts of the app down into the quality of their code, the churn rate, how much we're touching them, and the bug rate as well. So for example, the thing at the very top, it might be written badly, but its churn is very low, we don't really touch it much, and we don't get many to any bug reports from users when they're actually selling tickets. So that's pretty low on our list of things to migrate. On the other hand, the one at the very bottom is the other extreme. The code isn't good, we touch it lots, it's a file we all end up interacting with, and users report lots of bugs. So that would be the kind of thing we'd pick. And you can kind of roughly prioritize these based on these three factors, and also a bit of personal preference as well. I'm sure some of you would disagree with some of the orderings. And we also wanted to mix larger bits of work with shorter bits as well. Sometimes it was really nice to feel like we were progressing, but we knew certain parts of the app would take weeks to migrate. They're very, very complicated. There's lots of different scenarios. They weren't going to be quick fixes. That's really nice sometimes, and I know that I like getting my head down into a project that's going to take a few weeks at least, and it can be very nice to have that all mapped out and work on. But sometimes it's also nice to just kind of push out 3 or 4 quick fixes in a day or 2. So we kept a big list, the backlog, and we had all sorts of work. And you can see we roughly did large, medium, and there might be a small somewhere. We had all sorts of different things going on. And the team could kind of come in and pick out bits as they wanted to here too. And if we did take on really large bits of work, we split it up. We used Trello checklists pretty aggressively, but obviously whatever particular app you prefer to use. But splitting those larger bits of work into lots of smaller cards still meant even though the work wouldn't be released for a few weeks, you could see the progress as you were going bit by bit. And we also took advantage of Git and branches to do this as well. So one of the big areas of the app was the queue. So this is when we're selling, say for Adele, we can't manage 100,000 people on the store at once. So we put them into a queue where they sit, just like if you've bought tickets online for like any popular thing ever, you've been in a queue. And we needed to rewrite that. And we knew that would take a few weeks. And rather than have like one branch that will probably merge conflict when we pull it back in, it'll be like thousands of lines to review, we did this thing where we pull off from master, we'd have like queue master. And then any other pull request would be from a queue something into queue master, and you could review those bit by bit. And then eventually, at some point, queue master is finished, and you can merge it back into master. And this was really nice. You're working on a long project. You're still able to get regular pull request reviews and get things checked over regularly and just kind of have those moments. I don't know about anyone else, but when I push code to GitHub and open a pull request, I do a quick review of my own stuff and often find things that I've missed. So that was a really nice way of doing that. And we really stuck quite aggressively to releasing early and releasing often, hopefully multiple times a day. We're always migrating stuff out. This keeps up the momentum as well. And it also means if you push something where there's a bug in it, you can spot that very quickly because you know exactly what's just been released. And doing the smaller bits you do, the kind of easier it is to spot that particular bug. Oh, and I'm not really sure what's happened to the background there, but this slide says the lottery factor on it with a nice contrast. And this was a key part of our work as well was moving away from the previous situation where the old developers had left and we struggled to understand a lot of the code because we didn't know it. A lot of places call this the bus factor. So like how many people, what trouble are you in if Jack gets hit by a bus tomorrow? We're a bit cheerier than that, so we call it the lottery factor. which is what happens if I win the lottery tomorrow and disappear to a kind of tropical island? You know, how messed up are we? And I've always found wherever I've been that kind of keeping documentation in sync with code is really challenging. I've never kind of found a way to fix it. But we tackled this by just dumping stuff into Git. We called it the migration knowledge base, which effectively is notes in a markdown file, but migration knowledge base sounds much smarter. And we just dumped little bits of information, anything we came across that thought might be weird, something that could trip another developer up, or something that I've just lost an hour on that I can save you an hour on if I dump this in here now. So that was really valuable to us as well. And bearing in mind that we're running for such a long period of time, tracking some form of metrics to know how far along we are was also really important. That's incredibly difficult to say at any one time. We are 50% of the way through, we are 80%, we are whatever. But we came up with some really rubbish bash scripts that got us some kind of very rough numbers. These don't have to be accurate, and they shouldn't be. You shouldn't waste time getting these really accurate. But just having some numbers so you can get a sense of progressing over this long time period really, really helped. So we had this one which like grept for like ng inject or import Angular to get a rough guess of how many Angular files there were. And we did the same for React. You can compare these numbers. So this is a very out-of-date screenshot. You know, when I did this, we were roughly 50-50 based on this particular metric. I think metric is a rather grandiose term for what this was. But, you know, as we progressed, and this ran every time we pushed a build, you could see that, you know, the top number went down and the bottom number went up. And this is so far from accurate, but it was quite nice to see this number changing over time. Oh yeah, and there you go. And that's a more recent one where the numbers changed a bit more in my favor. And we also had a Google spreadsheet where we broke down big things, medium things, and small things, roughly gave them points. The number system we used here changed almost daily, so the actual numbers didn't mean much, but we knew that this big 43% roughly, probably not out of 100, probably out of 105 or something based on our maths. But crucially, we could break things down and give them a rough estimate, and we knew that over time we were progressing and heading in the right direction. This was something we could also show externally to prove that we weren't just messing around and things were actually changing. It's particularly important when the actual goal is to not change anything. Like the goal here is that a user visits the site every week, they never know that we're doing this migration. So having some way of actually kind of quantifying what you have done was really important, both for our team and for the wider business who'd kind of backed that we would get this done. And finally, just to finish off, I want to talk a bit about the communication, not only internally as the tech team doing this work, but externally with other parts of the business who were stakeholders in this application. And you're talking people like customer support who get the angry emails from users who fail to get tickets of their favorite artist and are incredibly annoyed. And you're also talking about the people who had to go out to the people who manage like Adele or whoever and talk to them and kind of get a deal for them to use Songkick. And it turns out, this is probably surprising to you as it was to me, that these people don't really care about frameworks. Shocking, I know, but it turns out not everyone cares as much as we do about which library we're using. So when I first started doing this migration and we kind of tried to communicate it across the business, you know, and I talked to them in framework terms. So, well, Angular 1 is reaching its end of life and React offers a much better component model. Oh, that's dull, isn't it? React's lifecycle methods and small API is easier for developers to learn. And then React state model is less magical. Its unidirectional data flow really simplifies code and makes it easy. I don't even know what that means. And so really communicating in this sense to people outside of technology was a waste of time for all involved. And it really led to people not getting this work. And you know, they come to us and say, oh, what's changing at the moment on the site? We say, well, nothing. That's the point. You won't see any changes. And then that is quite hard for them to see this tech team making no visible changes for long periods of time. So really, we tried to revert this and come at it from their point of view. And this was much more effective, saying things like, well, when you ask for a new feature or a new bug, it takes more time than it should because we don't understand the code. We also believe that we can improve our mobile load time and performance. We knew that over 50% of our users were not on desktop, were on mobile devices, so we knew that this would probably have a big impact. Side note as well, depending on like the age of the artist we were selling tickets for, the like mobile versus desktop would really dramatically vary, which is quite interesting. Like older artists, it was like 90% desktop, and then like some hip new band, it was about 90% mobile, which was kind of interesting to see. We also fixed bugs that caused pain for other departments. So we had one bug where some users, a very, very small percentage, would get stuck in this payment processing where they'd submitted their card details, something went wrong somewhere, and they were kind of stuck. They didn't know whether they bought their tickets or the payment had failed. They couldn't re-enter, and it was basically just a dreadful bug. And this existed for a while, and we didn't get around to fixing it. And this meant every time we had a sale, poor old people in customer support got angry emails from users who had missed out on tickets. If they miss out on tickets and they sell out, it's not like we have lots extra to just give away, so it's very hard to placate these people. But we were able to fix it, and we were able to use the migration as the context for fixing it. We said, well, we migrated the credit card form to React, and we fixed this bug as well. And that, and that really gave people a lot of confidence. Okay, this migration is having kind of impactful changes that we can understand. And really, this was about keeping people in the loop. We use Slack extensively for this. It doesn't really matter what the medium is, but just kind of communicating lots about the changes you're making made a real difference. And we also had to deal with fires as well. Ultimately, although as much as we test and as much as we try, if you're migrating a complicated piece of software, you will cause bugs. It's just inevitability. It will happen, and it's important to deal with it in the correct way. Unfortunately, some things will go wrong. I found this on Twitter. The link is down below, so I'm not taking credit. They say there are two types of developer. There are those who have broken production and those who are about to break production, which I found accurate at every single job I've ever had. I broke the build today at work, by the way. So this is kind of my chance to say sorry to the 3 people who bought tickets for a concert on the wrong day in Tokyo because of me. Turns out if you migrate a date component and you change the date library that's used for passing the date, it might work slightly differently in different time zones. So yeah, that happened. That was the first bit of React code we shipped. So that was good. But yeah, we did get those people tickets, and it was all good, and it was fine. But yeah, that was not a good start. But whenever these things happened, we kind of wanted to just show that we took it as seriously as anyone else. So we tried to send around an email that said what went wrong, why didn't we catch it, how will we fix it, but most importantly, how will we prevent it happening again. I think everyone could let us off with a bug, but if that same bug reoccurs next week, that's not going to do us any favors. And we did this via big emails. We called them fire out emails. Say like what happened, explanation of the bug, the fix of the bug, why we didn't catch it, but most importantly, the follow-up steps and how we'll catch it in the future. And just kind of gives a sense of the work you're doing and also that you're taking it seriously when things go wrong, because ultimately things will go wrong. So just to round up with some kind of conclusions or takeaways, don't migrate for the sake of it. I don't want this talk to come across as we moved from Angular to React because I don't like Angular and I do like React. That was one of many reasons, but crucially not the only reason. If the code had been in a really good state and we could work with it and iterate on it, and it worked, we wouldn't have migrated just because of Angular. Ultimately, we spent a lot of time and effort on the migration without new features coming through as much as they could have otherwise. Plan, and plan again, particularly on a larger app. We ended up actually printing off screens of pages and sticking them to the wall and highlighting bits we'd done and bits we would do next. Kind of getting out of like, well, there's so many bits on this app, and splitting it down was really valuable. Cross-business communication was so important, which should have realized earlier. Probably the most important bit of this whole process was keeping everyone on side. Prioritize based on pain points in your current application. Pain points not just for you, but for the users and for the people who deal with those users. Mix up all the tasks based on the difficulty and type to kind of keep it interesting, so your work doesn't become mundane as you're migrating this stuff over and over again. Track metrics internally and externally to kind of let you know how you're doing and that sense of progress. And don't expect to migrate perfectly the first time. We kind of fell into this trap of thinking that migrating Angular component A to React component A, that React component had to be the best component that had ever been written. And that's not going to happen, unfortunately, as much as we'd all like it to. There's nothing wrong with migrating something to React and putting a task in to come back to that and think that you could do something in a better way. Often we found the best thing was to get something from Angular to React, even if we didn't love the design of it. Because by doing that migration process, you then understand a lot more about the component you've just migrated, and you have more ideas on how you could improve it. So thank you very much for listening. If you do want to find me on Twitter, that's me. You can also email me at jack@thread.com. I put 2 T's in there by mistake. That's good. Jack@thread.com is his. Oh, no, it's not. It's just the underscore, isn't it? Yeah, I read that as thread. All right. Yeah, that's not good design, is it? As you can tell, I'm a front-end developer. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. I'll put the slides up online and tweet them later as well, and come and grab me if you've got any questions. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Jack. I'm sure we've all felt a lot of that pain ourselves. Questions?
A super quick one. Would you do this again?
If I rephrase that to, do I think we made the right decision to do it? Then yes, I do think we did make the right decision. Yeah, yeah. I would like to do some actual shipping of features in the near future, but yeah, I do think we made the right decision. There's a few back there. Oh.
Hello.
Hey.
So I don't really understand Angular. So do React components translate to Angular components directly, or would you rewrite everything now that it's in React? Because there'd be different advantages to that.
So you'd rewrite the component. The way I did it is I'd split my screen in two, and I'd have the Angular one on the left and a new React one on the right, and I just port bits of functionality over. Normally it was a case of, you can copy and paste a fair amount, but Angular components also have like a distinct template that is just an HTML file and then some JavaScript. So my first step usually was to take that HTML and copy that into my render function on the React component, turn it into JSX, and then go from there. But on the most part, kind of Angular's JavaScript plus template maps fairly well to a React component. Yeah, you can normally do it on like a one-to-one basis, with like exceptions.
So about a year after starting your migration, did you look back and think, oh, we should have done that a little bit differently? If you were to do it again, what would you do differently?
This sounds really bad, but on the whole, I think we did quite a good job. I think what we didn't do is we didn't plan soon enough. So in the first couple of months, it was kind of all very experimental. We kind of randomly, arbitrarily picked bits of thing to migrate before we kind of got into this idea of planning it and then prioritizing different bits. That led to, we got a lot of very small bits migrated early on, which was really good, but they were it was a very scattergun approach, and they were all jotted throughout the site. So that meant it was very tricky for other people to keep up or to really see the value in it, because they're like, well, why have you migrated the date component over here and this random button over here? That didn't really make sense. Once we split it into actually like migrating bigger chunks at once, like a particular form or a particular like banner or row, that made a lot more sense both to us, we could keep track, and also to other people as well.
Awesome. Cheers.
Hi. So you converted directives to React components,
Yeah.
which is cool because they pretty much map like for like. They're different frameworks, but fair enough, I can see that. But while you were going through that migration, did you consider improving the architecture at the same time? Because what you've talked about kind of assumes you didn't really change the architecture, or that the existing architecture was kick-ass enough for you to leave it alone.
I think what we did more, we'd migrate something over knowing that the architecture was bad, and then go and improve that then, because we found it easier to do once we pulled it out of Angular and into React. So an example of that is we tried to move any data that we needed to into Redux, which kind of a whole other area of the talk that I didn't go into. So we would have an Angular like controller and then an Angular component or directive, shift that over and then push the data, because an Angular controller doesn't really map to anything in React world, it just maps to like logic in the component. So we tried to get rid of that because that doesn't really fit.
I guess that was more my question. Like, you've got a heap of stuff in your Angular controller. Yeah. What are you doing with that? Surely you're pulling it up to abstract it from the view layer.
Yeah. So any kind of core, I guess the like slightly cringy term is business logic. Any kind of business logic we would pull into just hopefully plain JavaScript modules. Yeah. So whereas Angular would have like factories and services and controllers and all those things that largely equate to an object with some functions, we would create just standalone JavaScript that had those functions in, and we push the data as much as possible into Redux where we could. If that's answering your question, if not, come and grab me.
Is answer. I would love to talk to you afterwards.
Yeah, no, definitely, yeah. We'll definitely go into more detail. Sorry, I might be misunderstanding.
I was just wondering, so if this was live, you were giving out 2 frameworks at once. So, the thing I'm wondering is how this affects page speed, and also, as you went through the process of running these bash scripts that were sort of telling you your progress of flipping over, did you either record or notice how your page speed varied with this?
So yeah, the answer to the question is that it didn't help the page speed. It certainly got slower. As much as anything, we had to load 2 frameworks, which adds a fair amount of weight before you've even done anything else. That was effectively the biggest downside of doing this migration in this way, is we did have to pay that cost, and ultimately the users had to pay that cost. For us, we went with it because they weren't getting a great experience anyway. Like Angular plus all the dependencies we had was far too big for our liking. So adding React was like just making it only a tiny bit worse, which isn't a good answer, but that's kind of the way we went. We didn't track page speed. We did track the size of the bundle, and we had the tool called, I think it's it's something like Webpack Bundle Analyzer or Bundle Webpacky Analyzer-y thing. And that made us very aware of any specific big dependencies that we could get rid of. The biggest one was Angular. So getting rid of that would have done most of the work for us. But things like we spotted that we were using Moment.js just for like one small function to pass a date, and we swapped that out for some other much smaller thing and saved like 50 kilobytes doing that. So we did try and make wins where we could, but ultimately we decided to defer any work on the page performance and bundle size and page speed to after the migration, where we're in a better place to do it.
Can you ballpark how much size you saved at all?
Generally, or once Angular had gone?
Once you finished from beginning to end?
Once we'd finished. So we were shipping, just before we'd finished, about a meg of JavaScript, and Angular made up a good few hundred kilobytes of that. Angular, not just Angular, but Angular and like Angular Router and Angular Animate and Angular whatever else that made up Angular as a whole that we were using would have, come close to halving our bundle. But the plan was after that to do a lot more work to then very aggressively bring that down and like dynamically load in things with Webpack and the rest of it. We didn't get there.
Thanks.
Hi. So you mentioned that Redux as part of the migration. Did you approach it? Obviously, you mentioned approached it in a piecemeal fashion, but did you approach it from the Vue presentation layer first and then Redux, or did you do them both at the same time?
We do the Vue layer first as much as possible. One thing, we had Redux, and I love Redux, I think it's great, but one of the things we tried to do is only put data in there that we definitely needed in there. We found like a lot of components just didn't need data in Redux. They could just have the data as their own local state. So we didn't want to just dump everything blindly into Redux. So we try to be quite considered in that approach. So we do the Vue layer first. We'd kind of do it sometimes not nicely because we knew that we might need something like Redux, and we kind of get it working, and then you could take a step back and refactor bits out. We tried to resist the temptation of just going straight to Redux as like the first port of call, when a lot of components could just have local state. It was a fine like balancing act that we didn't always get right.
Thanks.
There was one question over here. Yeah.
Last one, because we're running out of time.
Since the very beginning, so I feel a bit bad.
Hello.
Hey.
Sounds like you went through a lot of trouble with the migration. My question is, since all of these guys mentioned Redux and React, why didn't you in the first place rewrite the whole thing from scratch, since you pretty much went through so much trouble?
Because we needed to release new features, and so if we'd have had them side by side, releasing a new feature would have led to us having to do it twice. The new feature we actually did release during this migration, we wrote in React and integrated it into Angular. Also, in the history of that Songkick at the time, this app, the Angular app, had formed itself from a big rewrite of an older app. So really, like convincing everyone else that we're just going to blow this all away and start from scratch wasn't really an option because of kind of contextual business reasons. I still would back that this is the better way to do it. I think we did have some pain, but I think we also learned a lot along the way that probably would have hit us if we'd have built it from scratch at a point too late where we'd have had to go back and re-architect a lot of stuff. Doing it this way meant that we could learn a bit more as we went. And yeah, there is extra work. Like we wrote code that we knew would have to be deleted at some point because it was kind of migration like plumbing. But on the whole, I still think it was the right decision. But yeah, that wouldn't have been the worst decision to just blow it all away. In some ways, it would have been nicer. It's a tough balancing act, I think.
Thanks, Jack.
Okay, thank
you. That's brilliant. We're going to have a 10-minute break.